My name is Sophie Brown. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward steadiness, operations, planning, the kind of work where you notice what others overlook and fix it quietly. If you met me in passing, you might think I'm calm to the point of being unremarkable. I've been told I'm easygoing, low maintenance, even lucky because I don't seem to ask for much. People often mistake that for softness, or worse, for a lack of depth. What they don't see is that calm isn't the absence of feeling. It's something I learned early, a way of surviving a family system where comparison was constant and affection was conditional. Growing up, I was the child who did fine, so attention went elsewhere. My sibling was the bright one, the difficult one, the one with stories attached. I was the background, useful, reliable, quiet, not unloved in any obvious way, but rarely chosen first. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong or staging a dramatic reckoning. It's about what happens over time when favoritism becomes normal, when being compared is framed as motivation, and when a child learns that being less visible is safer than being seen. It's about the long-term psychological damage of that kind of upbringing, and the quiet ways it shapes your decisions long after you leave home. I'll walk you through the moments that seemed small at the time, comments brushed off as jokes, expectations that were never spoken but always enforced, the role I was assigned without my consent. I'll share how I learned to stay silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because speaking never changed the outcome. And I'll tell you about the shift that happened much later. Not an argument, not a confrontation, but a private realization that reframed everything I thought I owed my family. There are no villains here in the cartoon sense. My parents did what they thought was practical. My sibling played the part they were encouraged to play, and I played mine well enough that no one questioned it. What changed wasn't them. It was my understanding of myself and the boundaries I quietly put in place once I understood the cost of always being the easy one. If you're looking for explosive drama, this won't be that. What I'm offering is honesty about how favoritism lingers, how it teaches you to shrink, and how reclaiming yourself doesn't always require a fight. Sometimes it's a series of small, deliberate choices made without announcement. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own story in mine. Maybe you were compared, minimized, or praised only when you stayed convenient. If that's you, I want you to know this. Noticing the pattern is not bitterness, it's clarity. Have you ever wondered how different you might feel today if someone had chosen you without comparison? When I think about who I was to my parents, the word that comes closest isn't unloved. It's assumed. I was assumed to be fine, assumed to cope, assumed to understand. From the outside, we probably looked like a functional family. No shouting, no obvious neglect, dinner on the table, school events attended, photos taken on holidays where everyone smiled at roughly the right moment. But within that structure, there was a clear hierarchy of emotional gravity. My sibling had it. I orbited around it. From as early as I can remember, my sibling was described in extremes. They were brilliant, challenging, special. Their moods were discussed, anticipated, and managed. When they succeeded, it was celebrated loudly. When they struggled, it became a family concern. Conversations bent toward them naturally, like metal drawn to a magnet. I, on the other hand, was described with words that sounded like compliments but functioned more like conclusions. Sophie's sensible. Sophie doesn't mind. Sophie's easy. Those labels closed doors. They meant fewer questions were asked about how I felt, because the answer was presumed in advance. I was the child who didn't require follow-up. At school, if my sibling brought home a high grade, it was framed as proof of their potential. If I did the same, it was treated as confirmation of expectation. Of course you did well, my parents would say, already moving on to the next topic. When my sibling failed, it sparked concern. When I failed, rare, but it happened, it was met with confusion, sometimes disappointment, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement to stay stable. I learned early that praise and attention weren't distributed evenly. They were responsive. You received them by causing a ripple. I didn't like causing ripples. I watched how quickly admiration could turn into anxiety, how being the focus came with pressure and scrutiny. So I stayed where it was safer, useful, reliable, quiet. There were moments that hinted at this dynamic, small enough to dismiss individually. At family gatherings, relatives would ask my sibling about their plans, their ambitions. When they turned to me, the questions were softer, vaguer. And you're doing well too, right? It wasn't meant to hurt, but over time, it taught me that my inner world wasn't particularly interesting to anyone else. At home, responsibilities fell to me naturally. If something needed organizing, remembering, or smoothing over, I did it. Not because I was asked explicitly, but because no one else noticed it needed doing. I became adept at anticipating needs, setting the table before being told, mediating small tensions, keeping things running. My parents appreciated this, but appreciation isn't the same as recognition. Gratitude was brief. Expectation was permanent. What I didn't feel, at least not consciously, was resentment. I told myself a story that made everything reasonable. My sibling needed more support. They were under more pressure. I was stronger. I could handle it. That narrative allowed me to feel mature instead of overlooked. It was a bargain I didn't realize I was making. I traded visibility for approval. In photos from that time, I'm often standing slightly apart, smiling politely. I look composed. People comment on how grown up I seemed, even as a child. What they didn't see was how that composure was practiced. I learned how to edit myself, to downplay excitement, to soften disappointment, because strong reactions didn't fit the role I occupied. To my parents, I was the child who would be okay, the one they didn't worry about, the one they could lean on without asking how heavy the weight felt. They weren't cruel, they were practical, but practicality repeated over years can carve a person into a shape they never chose. I didn't know it then, but this was where it started. Not with a single wound, but with a pattern. Being compared didn't make me want to compete. It made me want to disappear just enough to stay safe. And once a family learns that you'll accept that position, they rarely question whether you should have had a choice. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so easy to overlook. I was about 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper I'd worked on for days. It was a short story, nothing extraordinary, but it mattered to me. I'd stayed up late rewriting it, erasing holes through the page, trying to make it sound like something worth reading. When I finally handed it to my mother, she skimmed the first few lines, nodded, and smiled in that distracted way adults do when their attention is already elsewhere. "That's nice, Sophie," she said. Then, almost immediately, she turned to my sibling. "Did you finish your maths revision? Remember, you've got that test tomorrow." That was it. No malice, no insult, just a pivot. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Adults were busy, tests were important, stories could wait. I folded the paper and put it back in my bag, feeling slightly embarrassed for having expected more. What I didn't realize was that something had been registered, quietly and permanently. Effort didn't guarantee interest. Not mine, anyway. After that, moments like it accumulated. Not enough to cause an argument, never enough to justify a complaint. When my sibling talked about their worries, conversations slowed to accommodate them. When I tried to share something, an idea, a concern, even excitement, it often landed in a gap between tasks. I learned to speak in shorter sentences, to offer information instead of feelings. One afternoon, a few years later, I came home with a certificate for consistent academic performance. It wasn't flashy, no first place medal, no headline, just proof that I'd been steady. Again, my father glanced at it and said, "Good, we expect that from you." Then he asked my sibling why their grades had dipped and how he could help. That sentence, "We expect that from you," settled somewhere deep. Expectations sounded like trust, but it functioned like a ceiling. It meant my achievements didn't change my position. They maintained it. What hurt wasn't that my sibling received attention. It was that my own inner life felt increasingly irrelevant. I began to notice how often I edited myself before speaking. If something was likely to be brushed aside, I kept it to myself. If it might complicate the emotional balance of the room, I swallowed it. And the strangest part was how invisible this process was to everyone else. Teachers praised me for being independent. Relatives admired how self-sufficient I was. Even my parents would occasionally say how grateful they were that I didn't add stress to their lives. They meant it kindly, but each time it reinforced the same lesson. My value lay in not needing. I didn't name this as pain. I named it maturity. I told myself I was learning how the world worked. Some people required more. Some people adapted. I was adapting. But adaptation has a cost when it's one-sided. Each small dismissal taught me to lower my expectations, not of myself, but of what I could safely ask for. I stopped sharing unfinished thoughts. I stopped asking for help unless it was strictly necessary. I stopped assuming that being heard was a given. Years later, when people would describe me as low drama, I'd nod along. I didn't correct them. They didn't see the early training that made drama feel dangerous, not because of punishment, but because of indifference. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar in any obvious way. It simply taught me where not to press. And once you learn that, you start shaping your whole self around avoidance. The people around me never noticed the change. They just enjoyed the result. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like the natural order of things. Comparison had become so woven into daily life that I rarely questioned it. It showed up in casual remarks, in expectations disguised as advice, in the way praise and concern were rationed. If my sibling forgot a responsibility, my parents would talk it through, offering reminders, second chances, and understanding. If I forgot something, the reaction was quieter but sharper. "That's not like you," they'd say, a note of disappointment underneath. I learned quickly that mistakes were more expensive for me. They didn't spark support, they threatened my role. So I worked harder to maintain it. At family dinners, stories about my siblings dominated the table. Their challenges, their plans, their potential. When I contributed, it was usually to fill in a practical detail or smooth a transition. "Sophie will remember. Sophie can handle that." I became a supporting character in conversations about my own family. What made it confusing was that none of this was overtly cruel. There were no insults, no shouting matches. If I'd tried to articulate what felt wrong, I wouldn't have had the language. After all, I wasn't being mistreated. I was being relied upon. And reliance looks a lot like respect if you don't look too closely. I started to internalize the idea that my needs were less urgent. When something bothered me, I'd wait until it passed. When I felt overwhelmed, I'd tell myself it was temporary. My siblings' emotions, on the other hand, were treated as events. They required attention, discussion, and sometimes intervention. Mine were weather, acknowledged briefly, then moved through. Teachers noticed this dynamic too, though they interpreted it positively. I was the student who didn't cause problems, the one who could be trusted to work independently. When group projects were assigned, I naturally took on the organizing role. It felt familiar, comfortable even. Being in charge without being visible was something I'd been practicing for years. At home, I began to preempt disappointment. If I sensed tension, I'd adjust my behavior to avoid adding to it. If my sibling were struggling, I'd make myself smaller. I told myself this was kindness, that I was helping. And in a way, I was. But I was also disappearing. The comparisons continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes careless. Your sibling is just more expressive. You've always been the strong one. We don't worry about you the same way. Each statement landed as a reassurance on the surface, but underneath it carried the same message. You don't require as much. I didn't push back. Not because I agreed, but because pushing back felt pointless. The few times I hinted at feeling overlooked, the response was swift and dismissive. You know we love you. Don't be sensitive. You're reading too much into it. So I stopped reading into it. Or rather, I stopped letting anyone see that I was. Over time, this normalized a low-grade disrespect, not in the sense of being treated badly, but in being treated as less complex. My interior life was simplified by others and eventually by me. I learned to present a version of myself that fit the expectations, capable, calm, and undemanding. The danger of this kind of normalization is that it doesn't feel like harm. It feels like an adaptation. You tell yourself you're choosing peace, that you're avoiding conflict, but what you're really doing is negotiating your own erasure in small, daily increments. I became very good at not needing, and everyone around me became very comfortable with that. It would take years before I understood that this wasn't resilience. It was conditioning. And once conditioning sets in, it's incredibly hard to see it for what it is, especially when everyone benefits from you staying exactly as you are. There was never a meeting where my family sat down and decided who I would be. No announcement, no agreement spoken aloud. The role was assigned the way these things usually are, through repetition, through what was praised, what was ignored, and what was quietly expected. By my late teens, I understood exactly where I fit. I was the reliable one, the backup plan, the emotional buffer. If something needed to be done without fuss, it fell to me. If someone needed listening to without interruption, that was me too. I had become the place where other people's needs landed. When my sibling had a crisis, my parents rearranged their schedules. When I had one, I postponed it. Not because anyone told me to, but because I'd learned that timing mattered, and my timing was never ideal. There was always something more urgent happening elsewhere. The strange part was how often this role was framed as a compliment. We trust you. You're so mature. We don't have to worry about you. Each phrase carried approval, and I absorbed it gratefully. Approval felt like a connection, even if it came at the cost of being seen fully. I noticed how differently my parents spoke about me versus to me. To my face, they were kind, encouraging in a general way. To others, they praised my usefulness, how I helped out, how I kept things together. I was described less as a person and more as a function. And I leaned into it because the alternative, stepping out of character, felt risky. What if I needed something and it disrupted the balance? What if my needs were inconvenient? Staying in role meant staying safe. At university, this pattern followed me. Friends came to me with their problems. I was the one who remembered birthdays, organized trips, mediated conflicts. I was proud of being dependable. It gave me a sense of purpose. But there was a quiet imbalance there too. I listened more than I was listened to. I supported more than I was supported. Back home, the comparisons didn't stop just because I was older. They simply matured. My siblings' career decisions were debated and worried over. My own choices were accepted without much discussion. "You'll figure it out," my parents would say, and move on. It sounded like confidence. It felt like dismissal. I rarely argued. Arguing required believing that my perspective deserved space. I wasn't sure it did. Instead, I adapted further. I learned to keep my ambitions understated, my disappointments private. I became skilled at managing expectations by lowering them, both others and my own. This role shaped how I saw myself. I took pride in being low impact. I measured my success by how little trouble I caused. Even when I achieved something meaningful, I downplayed it instinctively, as if drawing attention might somehow violate the unspoken contract I'd been living under. What I didn't see yet was that this role wasn't neutral. It wasn't just a personality trait. It was a position in a system that benefited from my silence. As long as I remained reliable and invisible, the family narrative held together neatly. My sibling was the focus, my parents were the managers, and I was the glue. Glue doesn't get thanked for holding things together. It's only noticed when it fails. I wouldn't understand that fully until much later, when the cost of staying in that role became impossible to ignore. Until then, I kept performing it well, convincing myself that this was just who I was. But roles learned in childhood have a way of tightening over time, and eventually they start to suffocate. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic line drawn in the sand. In fact, if you'd been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's what makes it hard to explain. The moment that changed everything looked like an ordinary afternoon. I was in my late 20s by then, home for a short visit. We were sitting in the living room, the television on, but no one really watching. My sibling was talking about work, about stress, about feeling unappreciated. My parents listened closely, offering reassurance, suggestions, and sympathy. I sat on the edge of the sofa, nodding at the right moments as I always did. At some point, my mother turned to me and said, almost as an aside, "You're lucky you're not like that. You've always been so self-sufficient." It was meant kindly, a small compliment offered without thought. I smiled automatically, but something inside me paused. Lucky. I replayed the word in my head while the conversation moved on without me. Lucky to have learned not to need. Lucky to have learned to swallow disappointment before it reached my face. Lucky to have become so good at being overlooked that it looked like strength. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't tell myself they were right or that I was overthinking. I simply sat with the discomfort and let it exist. And in that quiet space, a realization formed. Not emotionally, but logically. This wasn't an accident, it was a system. I saw, with a clarity that surprised me, how often my calm had been used as justification. Because I didn't ask, no one offered. Because I didn't complain, no one checked. My strength had become the reason my needs were invisible. That afternoon, nothing changed outwardly. I still helped clear the cups. I still said goodbye politely when I left, but internally, something had shifted from acceptance to observation. I started watching the dynamics instead of participating in them blindly. I noticed how quickly my parents leaned on me when something practical needed doing, and how rarely they asked how I was coping. I noticed how my siblings' emotions filled the room, while mine made themselves small. And for the first time, I stopped translating that into a story about my own adequacy. It wasn't that I was easier, it was what I had been trained to be. This realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way, a deliberate way. I began to understand that the role I'd been playing wasn't inevitable. It was maintained by habits, by expectations, by my own compliance. On the train back to my flat, I felt an unfamiliar mix of grief and clarity. Grief for the younger version of me who'd learned to disappear to keep the peace. Clarity about the fact that no one was going to hand me a different role unless I stopped performing the old one. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't explain my feelings. I didn't need to yet. What I needed was time to think, to observe, to decide what I was willing to continue giving. That day marked the beginning of a quiet separation, not physical distance, but psychological. I stopped assuming that being needed was the same as being valued. I stopped equating silence with maturity. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything changed. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, an instinctive response shaped by years of conditioning. Now, it was intentional. I didn't announce this shift. I simply stopped filling in the gaps the way I used to. At first, the difference was subtle. I paused before volunteering help. I let messages sit unanswered a little longer. When family conversations drifted toward my siblings' concerns, I listened, but I no longer rearranged myself around them. I noticed how uncomfortable that made me, and I resisted the urge to fix it. What surprised me was how quickly others interpreted this new silence as indifference or weakness, rather than as a boundary. When I didn't immediately step in, my parents seemed slightly confused, as if a familiar appliance had stopped working. "Are you tired?" they'd ask. "You've been quiet lately." I'd smile and say I was fine, and I was just not in the way they were used to. I began to understand that silence can be many things. For years, mine had been compliance. Now it was observation. I watched how often people relied on me without checking whether I had the capacity. I watched how rarely they noticed when I pulled back. The system adjusted slowly, awkwardly, as if unsure whether my absence was temporary. In my own life, this choice created space. I started using the energy I'd been spending on emotional maintenance for myself. I read more. I took courses quietly, without telling anyone what I was planning. I reviewed my finances, my long-term options. None of it was reactive. It was preparatory. When my parents called with small requests, I didn't rush to say yes. I asked for time. Sometimes I said no gently, without explanation. Each refusal felt strange, almost illicit. I'd been so accustomed to justifying my limits that not doing so felt like a transgression. My sibling didn't notice at first. They were still accustomed to being centered, but occasionally, when something went wrong and I didn't step in to smooth it over, they looked around as if something essential were missing. I stayed calm. I let the silence hold. This wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was learning what happened when I stopped making myself endlessly available. And what happened mostly was that people felt the absence without understanding its source. The most unsettling part was realizing how little protest there was. No one demanded an explanation. No one asked what I needed. They simply adapted around me, slowly. That told me something important. My presence had been useful, but not central, appreciated, but not examined. That knowledge hurt more than any argument would have. But it also freed me. If my role could be reduced without discussion, then it had never been as solid as I'd believed. And if it wasn't solid, I could step out of it entirely when I was ready. So I stayed quiet. I gathered information. I watched patterns repeat themselves without my intervention. Silence, once a survival strategy, became leverage, not over others, but over my own choices. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was stepping back far enough to see clearly. While everyone adjusted to my quieter presence, something else was happening, something no one thought to look for. For the first time in my life, I was preparing without narrating to myself. I've learned since then that people pay attention to noise, not movement. As long as you aren't announcing change, most assume nothing is changing at all. That assumption worked in my favor. I began by paying attention to patterns I'd once smoothed over automatically. Financial ones, emotional ones, legal ones. I noticed how often I was listed as an emergency contact, a backup, a default solution without ever being asked. I noticed how expectations were inherited, not discussed. How my reliability had quietly been built into other people's plans. So I started documenting. Not obsessively, not with bitterness, just carefully. I kept records of what I contributed, what I covered, and what I postponed for others. I looked at family arrangements I'd never questioned before. I reread emails I'd once skimmed. I asked neutral questions instead of offering immediate help. At the same time, I invested in myself in ways that didn't invite commentary. I improved my qualifications. I built savings with a discipline I'd once reserved for family stability. I spoke to advisors, financial, legal, not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I wanted clarity. Independence isn't an emotion, it's a structure. What no one noticed was how much I'd been holding together, and how deliberately I was now holding myself instead. My parents still described me as easy. My siblings still assumed I'd be there if things fell apart. That assumption persisted because I hadn't challenged it out loud. And that was the point. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated. When people believe you won't act, they stop monitoring you. They don't ask questions. They don't imagine alternatives. I let that belief stand. Emotionally, this period was quieter than you might expect. There was no thrill, no sense of revenge, just focus. Each small step felt like restoring balance. Not against them, but within me. I wasn't preparing to confront. I was preparing to exit a role. Sometimes I caught myself wanting to explain, to tell my parents what I'd realized, to name the imbalance, to ask for acknowledgement. But I stopped. I understood finally that explanation would only pull me back into the same dynamic. They would reassure, minimize, and reframe, and nothing structural would change. So I chose structure over sentiment. The irony is that I'd been capable of this kind of planning all along. I'd just been using it in the service of everyone else. Once I redirected it inward, progress was steady and quiet. By the time anyone sensed that something was different, it wasn't because I'd announced it. It was because the system they relied on was no longer fully operational, and they didn't know why. I did, and for the first time, that knowledge belonged entirely to me. The reveal wasn't a discovery in the cinematic sense. There was no single document, no shocking secret unearthed in one moment. It was quieter than that, more unsettling precisely because of how ordinary it was. It happened when I finally laid everything out in front of me, not emotionally, but practically. Numbers, timelines, responsibilities. I wanted to understand, in concrete terms, how much of my adult life had been shaped by assumptions I'd never agreed to. What I saw surprised me. I realized that I'd been anchoring more than just family logistics. Over the years, I'd absorbed financial responsibilities indirectly, covering gaps, delaying my own plans so others could stabilize theirs, choosing flexibility over growth because it kept the system running. None of this had been demanded outright. That was the most important part. It had been allowed. Because I never said no, my contribution had been treated as ambient. Like electricity, you only notice it when it goes out. The private reveal wasn't anger. It was clarity. I saw that my parents' future planning quietly assumed my availability. I saw how my siblings' risk taking was cushioned by the unspoken knowledge that I was there, steady, predictable. And I saw how little space there was in those plans for my own long term security. This wasn't malicious, it was structural. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never considered seriously before. What happens if I stop being the buffer? Not in theory, but in reality. Not emotionally, but logistically. The answer was uncomfortable and illuminating. Without my quiet contributions, timelines would shift, options would narrow, other people would have to adjust. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was no sense of triumph. If anything, it came with a heavy calm. Understanding your leverage isn't about using it, it's about recognizing that you have it at all. I also understood something else, equally important. If I waited to be asked to step back, it would never happen. The system had no incentive to change while it worked so smoothly. Any appeal to fairness would be absorbed, reframed, neutralized. So I made a decision privately. I would remove myself gradually and cleanly without accusation. I would disentangle, not detonate. This required restraint. It meant continuing to appear the same on the surface while making different choices underneath. It meant resisting the urge to explain myself for the sake of emotional relief. I'd spent a lifetime explaining. This time, I chose action. Knowing what I now knew, I felt something close to relief. Not because I was finally seen, but because I no longer needed to be. The clarity itself was enough. I didn't tell anyone about this moment. I didn't need witnesses. The power of the reveal was that it was mine alone, and that meant it couldn't be argued away. From that point on, every step I took was informed by this understanding. Quietly, irreversibly. There's a difference between realizing you have options and choosing one that closes the door on the others. For a while, I stayed in that in-between space, aware but undecided. I could have continued as before, just with better boundaries. I could have had a conversation, named the imbalance, and asked for a change. I could have stayed partially involved, renegotiated my role, softened the edges. I considered all of it. Each option came with its own cost. Speaking up promised relief, but also invited debate. I knew the pattern well enough by then. Reassurance, denial, hurt feelings, then a gradual return to normal. Partial withdrawal felt safer, but it would keep me tethered to expectations that had never been mine to begin with. The irreversible option was the quietest one. Full disengagement from the role I'd been assigned. Not from my family as people, but from the structure that relied on my silence. This decision didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with exhaustion. I was tired of calibrating myself around others' needs, tired of being praised for strength I'd never volunteered to develop, tired of knowing that my absence would be noticed only when it became inconvenient. So I chose a path that didn't require permission. I began planning my life as if my family were not a factor, not out of spite, but out of realism. I stopped delaying opportunities to stay available. I set timelines that served me, even when they conflicted with unspoken expectations. I prepared to say no in ways that couldn't be negotiated away. This was the point of no return, even though no one else knew it yet. Once you reorganize your future around yourself, there's no seamless way to fold back into an old role. The geometry changes. Emotionally, this choice felt stark. There was grief in it. Grief for the version of myself that had believed being needed was the same as being loved. Grief for the hope that one day, without prompting, someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. But there was also calm, a groundedness I hadn't felt before. For the first time, my decisions weren't reactions. They were declarations, even if they were never spoken aloud. I didn't frame this as cutting ties. That would have made it dramatic. Instead, I thought of it as withdrawing a resource that had been overdrawn for years. Quiet dominance isn't about force. It's about alignment, choosing actions that can't be undone because they finally match the truth. Once that decision was made, everything that followed felt strangely simple. Not easy, but clear. And clarity, I learned, is its own kind of point of no return. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or relief. What I felt was steadiness, a settling, as if something inside me had finally clicked into place after years of being slightly misaligned. From the outside, nothing about me appeared different. That was intentional. I had learned long ago that visibility invites interference. So I moved the way I always had, quietly, methodically, but this time with a different center of gravity. Every action now served a future that did not orbit my family's needs. I started with the practical things, because practical things are harder to argue with later. I reviewed my finances in detail, not with anxiety, but with precision. For years, I'd kept them flexible. I liked knowing I could adapt, step in, and cover gaps if needed. That flexibility had been framed by me and by others as responsibility. Now I saw it for what it also was, availability. So I removed it. I created buffers that were no longer accessible. I committed funds to long-term plans that couldn't be casually redirected. I chose stability over liquidity, structure over generosity. These weren't selfish decisions, they were corrective ones. I was closing doors that had been left open without my consent. At the same time, I began locking in commitments that prioritized my own trajectory. Professional opportunities I'd once postponed because now isn't a good time suddenly became non-negotiable. I accepted roles that demanded my full attention. I set schedules that couldn't bend around last-minute family needs. Each decision was small enough to seem reasonable, but together they formed a wall. I didn't announce any of this. Announcements invite discussion. Discussion invites compromise. I wasn't interested in compromise anymore. Not because I wanted distance, but because compromise had always flowed in one direction. When family conversations drifted toward the future, I listened carefully. My parents spoke in that familiar, inclusive language. We'll figure it out. We can handle that when the time comes. For years, we had quietly included me. This time, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I simply didn't adjust my plans to fit inside that word. There's a strange power in letting people assume something that is no longer true. It buys you time. And time, when used deliberately, becomes momentum. The most effective changes were the least dramatic ones. I formalized boundaries that had once lived only in my head. Where things had been implied, I made them explicit. Not emotionally, but administratively. clear arrangements, written agreements, defined limits. Structure did the work my voice never could. Outwardly, I remained the same, calm, polite, reasonable. That consistency worked like camouflage. If I'd suddenly become distant or cold, it would have raised questions. Instead, I stayed warm enough to avoid suspicion, neutral enough to avoid engagement. Requests still came, as they always had. At first, they sounded identical to the old ones, casual, confident, built on the assumption of yes, and the old reflex stirred in me immediately. That familiar urge to help, to smooth, to prevent inconvenience before it formed. I learned to pause. Not a dramatic pause, just long enough to check whether the request aligned with the life I was now building. Most of the time, it didn't, so I answered differently. I can't commit to that. That won't work with my schedule. I've already made other plans. I didn't apologize. I didn't over-explain. I didn't offer alternatives unless I genuinely wanted to. Each sentence was clean, factual, and closed. The silence that followed those responses was often longer than I expected. Not because they were harsh, but because they disrupted a pattern. People are startled when a reliable system stops producing the same output. My parents began to sound uncertain in ways I'd never heard before. Not upset, just slightly off balance. They'd circle back to requests, rephrase them, soften them, as if trying to find the version that would unlock the old response. I stayed steady. My sibling noticed next, though not consciously. Situations that once resolved themselves suddenly didn't. Plans stalled. Support wasn't automatic. They didn't confront me. They simply assumed circumstances had changed. In a way, they had. What was happening wasn't a rupture. It was a quiet reallocation of resources, time, energy, competence. For years, those things had flowed outward from me by default. Now they were being redirected inward, intentionally, without announcement. There were moments, late at night usually, when doubt crept in. I'd wonder if I was being unfair, if I was overcorrecting, if I owed more explanation, more gentleness, more transition time. Those thoughts came from habit, not truth. They were echoes of the old role, trying to reassert itself. I reminded myself of something simple. If my withdrawal required explanation, my contribution should have required consent. It never had. As weeks turned into months, the system began to strain in subtle ways, not catastrophically, just enough to be felt. Small inconveniences accumulated. Decisions took longer. Emotional labor shifted awkwardly between people unaccustomed to carrying it. Still, no one named it. That was the most revealing part. No one said, "Why aren't you doing this anymore?" No one asked, "Are you okay?" They adjusted around the absence rather than examining it, which told me something I needed to know. My presence had been instrumental, but not central. Necessary, but not acknowledged. I didn't take pleasure in that realization, but I did take clarity from it. By the time anyone might have wanted to renegotiate my role, the conditions for negotiation were gone. My life had been structured around different priorities. The flexibility that once made me useful had been replaced with commitments that couldn't be undone without cost. My cost. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment. It's about letting your actions solidify before your intentions are ever questioned. By the time the change becomes visible to others, it's already irreversible. And that's what made it peaceful. The first consequences didn't arrive as a conflict. They arrived in confusion. It showed up in small pauses during conversations, moments where someone expected me to step in, and I didn't. A question would hang in the air a little too long. A plan would stall, waiting for a solution that no longer came automatically. At first, these gaps were brushed off as a coincidence. Everyone assumed things would correct themselves. They didn't. My parents were the first to feel it, though they couldn't quite name what felt different. Tasks that had once resolved quietly now required effort. Decisions they used to defer now landed back in their hands. I noticed how often my mother hesitated mid-sentence, as if recalculating what to do next. She'd say things like, "We'll have to think about that," in a tone that suggested thinking hadn't been part of the process before. There was no accusation, no anger, just a subtle strain, a sense that something once dependable had become unpredictable. My sibling felt it differently. For them, the absence was registered as an inconvenience rather than a loss. Situations that had once been cushioned suddenly had edges. When things didn't go smoothly, they seemed genuinely surprised, as if the world had stopped accommodating them without notice. Once they joked, "You're being very hands-off lately." I smiled and said nothing. What struck me most was how no one connected the dots. The consequences were felt, but the cause remained invisible. Because I hadn't announced my withdrawal, it didn't register as a choice. It registered as a circumstance. And circumstances are easier to accept than agency. Emotionally, this phase was more challenging than I'd expected. Not because I missed the role, but because I was seeing clearly how it had functioned. Watching people struggle with responsibilities I'd carried silently for years stirred something close to grief. Not for them, but for myself. I realized how little margin I'd had, how much of my calm had been built on constant adjustment, and how invisible that labor had been even to the people who benefited most from it. There were moments when I could have stepped back in and resolved everything. The skills were still there. The knowledge was still mine. All it would have taken was a word, a suggestion, a few hours of effort. The old system could have been restored quickly. I didn't do it, not out of spite, but out of respect. For myself, stepping in now would have taught the same lesson it always had, that my boundaries were temporary, that my availability could be assumed with enough pressure. So I stayed still. The consequences deepened gradually, not dramatically enough to provoke confrontation, but enough to be felt. Plans were postponed, stress redistributed, emotional weight shifted to places it hadn't rested before. And still, no one asked the question that mattered most. That silence told me everything. The moment they realized something was wrong didn't come with urgency. It came with a creeping sense of unease, like discovering a familiar room had been rearranged while you weren't looking. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing. But the logic of the space no longer worked the way it used to. My parents started asking questions that circled the issue without touching it. "You've been busy lately, haven't you? Your schedule seems full these days." They weren't accusations. They were probes, gentle attempts to locate the old fault lines, the ones they'd relied on without naming. I answered honestly, but narrowly. Yes, I was busy. Yes, I had commitments. No, there was nothing wrong, all true. None of it is reassuring. What they didn't say, but clearly felt, was that their margin for error had shrunk. The buffer they'd grown used to had thinned. When plans went off course, there was no automatic correction. When emotions ran high, there was no quiet mediator stepping in to stabilize the room. The panic when it came was understated. It looked like reactivity disguised as concern. Suggestions came more frequently. Advice was offered where it hadn't been before. There was a subtle pressure to return to familiar rhythms, to reoccupy the space I'd vacated without announcing. "You don't have to do everything yourself," my mother said once, meaning the opposite of what the words implied. "We can help if you need it." my father added, though help had never been part of the old arrangement. They were reaching backward, not forward, trying to restore a balance that had depended on my silence. My sibling reacted with a different kind of confusion. They were unused to limits that didn't bend. When things became complicated, they grew restless, irritable. At one point, they said, "You've changed," not accusingly, but as if stating a fact they didn't understand. I nodded. People do. That was when I knew it was too late to fix things in the way they meant, because what they wanted wasn't conversation. It was restoration. They weren't asking who I was now. They were asking how to get the old system back online. And I couldn't give them that, even if I'd wanted to. The structures I'd put in place made reversal impractical. My life no longer had the elasticity it once did. My commitments weren't emotional promises. They were concrete realities. Time, once allocated, couldn't be quietly reclaimed. There was a moment, brief, sharp, when I felt the weight of finality, not triumph, not relief, just the understanding that a door had closed without slamming, that whatever repair might have been possible years ago required awareness that had never existed. They were too late, not because they hadn't tried hard enough, but because they hadn't noticed soon enough. And I was done explaining absence to people who had never explained expectation. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. There was no buildup, no argument waiting to spill over. It came during an ordinary visit, one of those neutral afternoons where nothing urgent was supposed to be discussed. We were sitting at the kitchen table again, the same table where so many small moments had passed unnoticed. My mother was the one who spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "We don't see you as much anymore." I nodded. I know. That was it. No denial, no apology, just acknowledgement. She waited, as if expecting me to fill the space the way I always had. When I didn't, my father leaned forward slightly. "Is there a reason?" he asked. I thought about all the possible answers, the years of comparison, the quiet labor, the assumptions. None of it felt necessary to list. Explanation would have turned this into a debate about intentions, and I wasn't interested in litigating the past. "I've built my life differently," I said. "That's all." My sibling watched from across the table, silent, visibly uncomfortable. They looked as though they were waiting for a reveal, a grievance, a confession, something dramatic enough to respond to. I offered none. My mother frowned, not in anger but in confusion. "We didn't know you felt distant." "I'm not distant," I replied calmly. "I'm just not as available." The distinction mattered to me. Distance implies emotional withdrawal. Availability implies access. I hadn't withdrawn my care. I'd withdrawn my automatic compliance. There was a pause then, a long one. I let it stretch. In the past, I would have rushed to soften it, to reassure, to make myself legible. This time, I allowed the discomfort to exist. My father sighed. "We always thought you were okay." "I was functioning," I said. Not sharply, not bitterly, just precisely. Something in the room shifted at that word. Functioning. It wasn't an accusation, it was a correction. No one argued, no one defended themselves. There was a quiet reckoning happening, but it wasn't loud enough to be called accountability. It was simply awareness arriving late. "I'm not asking you to change," I continued. "I already have." That was the closest thing to a line I'd ever drawn. The conversation ended soon after, not because it had reached a resolution, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. I hadn't demanded understanding. I hadn't offered blame. I'd stated a fact. And facts don't require agreement to remain true. When I left that day, There was no sense of victory, just a strange, unfamiliar lightness. I hadn't been heard in the way people imagine confrontation should be delivered, but I had been clear, and clarity, I was learning, was enough. I used to think identity was something other people reflected back to you, that you learned who you were by watching how others responded. For a long time, that meant I understood myself as the dependable one, the calm one, the person who didn't complicate things. Now I understand identity differently. It's not what you're assigned, it's what you stop consenting to. The version of me that exists now isn't louder or harder. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't reinvent myself through rebellion. If anything, I became more exact, more honest, less diluted by expectation. I still value steadiness. I still keep my word. I still notice details others miss. But those traits belong to me again. They're no longer extracted by default. I choose where they go. My relationship with my parents is quieter now, but clearer. We speak without the old assumptions humming underneath. They don't lean on me the way they used to. Sometimes I see the hesitation before they ask for something, and I let that pause exist. It's not punishment, it's recalibration. My sibling and I exist side by side rather than in orbit. There's less intimacy, but also less tension. I no longer manage the emotional weather between us. We meet where we meet, and we leave the rest untouched. The biggest change, though, is internal. I don't measure my worth by how little space I take up anymore. I don't equate silence with virtue or availability with love. When I choose to give now, it's because I want to, not because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't. There are moments when old instincts resurface, a reflex to smooth things over, a pull to step in. I notice them without acting. That awareness feels like progress. I've learned that favoritism doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like convenience. And the damage it does isn't loud, it's cumulative. It teaches one child to demand and another to disappear. I didn't disappear. I stepped out of a role that was never meant to be permanent. And in doing so, I found something quieter than validation, but stronger than approval. I found self-alignment. For a long time, I believed this story would end with understanding, that one day someone would look back, connect the dots, and say the words I never heard growing up. We see you. We should have done better. That ending is comforting. It's also rare. What I've learned instead is that closure doesn't always come from recognition. Sometimes it comes from refusal, from the quiet decision to stop participating in a narrative that requires you to shrink in order to belong. Favoritism leaves marks that aren't obvious. It doesn't always create rebellion. Often, it creates compliance. It teaches one child to be loud and another to be useful. And the useful one is praised just enough to keep going, but not enough to feel chosen. The long-term damage isn't about jealousy. It's about self-erasure. When you grow up being compared, you learn to evaluate yourself through other people's metrics. You learn to anticipate needs before you're asked. You learn that love is safest when it's earned through convenience. Over time, you stop asking what you want, because wanting feels disruptive. That's the quiet harm of favoritism. It doesn't break you. It reshapes you. What changed my life wasn't confrontation or revenge. It was something far less dramatic and far more difficult. Alignment. Choosing to live in a way that no longer required my silence to function. Letting people feel the absence of what I'd been providing without explanation or apology. Some relationships softened. Some grew distant. None returned to what they were. And that's okay. Growth rarely preserves old structures intact. I don't tell this story to vilify my parents or my siblings. They lived inside the same system I did, but I tell it because so many people carry this kind of invisibility without language for it. They think they're broken because they're tired, or ungrateful because they want more. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Noticing the imbalance doesn't make you cruel. Stepping back doesn't make you selfish. And choosing yourself doesn't require permission from the people who benefited from your self-neglect. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about no longer losing yourself. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you were the easy one, the strong one, the one who was never worried about, I'd like to hear from you. In what ways did your family's dynamics shape who you became? And what are you just now realizing you don't have to carry anymore? Your story matters too.